Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Clay Risen, the author of Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. He's written a half dozen books about Martin Luther King, Teddy Roosevelt, and whiskey. And he's also a reporter at the New York Times. Mr. Risen, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Clay Risen says the idea for this book didn't necessarily come from something that he wanted to explain to us. Rather, he wanted to explain something to himself. Why would his high school team change names from the Big Red to the Big Maroon? Why would the Cincinnati baseball team start to call itself the Redlegs? Why were there so many patriotic heroes on TV? Why would a fourth grade teacher be warning about communism? Well, the fear, he says, has to do with the word infiltration. How were the Soviets secretly inflicting their way of life on our own? So, Clay, I will kick this off with obviously 2020 hindsight here. Were fears of the other way of life blown out of proportion, or was it reasonable to take measures against communism and Soviet dictatorship?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and look, I did not set out to write a book of current events when I started working on this.
Little did you know. Little
Little
did
did
you
I
know.
know, and but unfortunately, it's right on the nose. But when I started working on it, I was animated by this question that you raised, and that was, why did the Red Scare happen when it did? Why did it take the shape that it did? And I don't go into this a lot in the book, but I was in the back of my mind animated by a certain question or sort of corollary, which was, you know, the British, for example, faced at least as big a threat from Soviet espionage as we did, if not more. The French and Italians had large communist parties that were supported by the Soviet Union and had real concerns in the late 40s and early 50s of violence, of some move toward revolution, of some sort of real subversion, much more than we did in the United States. And none of those countries had anything approximate to what we went through. Most of them had fairly reasonable responses to subversion and espionage. So the question was, why did the United States react differently? And the common answer that people throw around to explain the Red Scare is, well, that's what Americans do. Americans, every once in a while, we go crazy. And whether it's the Salem witch trials or the Know Nothing Party or what have you, conspiracy theories and hysteria sort of bubble to the top every once in a while, and then it disappears. And it's not wrong. I mean, those things are facts in American history, and there's something to be said about an aspect of the American mind that goes toward those corners every once in a while. But I was not satisfied with that as an answer. And so for me, I wanted to find something a little more historical, so to speak. And so the argument of the book really is that, setting aside the legitimate concerns about Soviet espionage and I think ultimately kind of minor concerns about subversion in the United States. Uh, the real issue was that the Red Scare was a cultural conflict. And that's a lot of what the book goes into, is the political, cultural aspects of the Red Scare, and looking at it as this fight between progressives coming out of the New Deal, and not just the New Deal as a set of policies, but the New Deal as as a cultural construct, and then a conservative push back against that after the war.
And so, how important is the end of World War II and this post world order that is developing, and new lines are being drawn across the world about who gets to sort of control what? How did the end of World War II give way to this nearly 50-year Cold War between these two very powerful nations? Why were the US and Russia sort of destined to rise to the top and then to the opposite ends of this post World War II era?
Yeah, the end of the war and the fact that the war immediately preceded this era, or this era sort of followed directly on it, is not coincidental. And you put your finger on one aspect of it, which I think is, or they're related. The emergence of the Cold War was really important. And one of the things that gets, I think, sometimes glossed over, actually always glossed over, is how traumatic World War II was for the United States. I mean, we won the war, obviously, and victory and everything's very happy. But look, hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed. Um, Hundreds of thousands more were wounded. They came back with what today we would call PTSD, which was not recognized at the time. This had an impact on families. This had an impact on the culture of the country, and there was a real fear that depression would return after the war. America had sacrificed on the home front a lot, so to get through the war, and then there's this uncertainty about what's going to happen. So there was a lot of fear, and if you go back to movies and magazines and whatnot produced right after the war, you can see this, but it was glossed over later by a triumphalist history. So there's that on the one hand. There's also a sort of eagerness to continue the culture of the war in a weird way because it was very uh, uh, security was guaranteed. Security was the watchword. Uh, Domestic security was very important to the American public, to the American government, whether it meant a beefed up FBI or putting Japanese Americans in detention camps. This was the norm for a long time, and it was sold as this is what's necessary. So there's that, and then there's the global context. And it didn't take a soothsayer or a crystal ball to see that during World War II there was going to be another conflict afterward between the United States and the Soviet Union. To say that it was going to take the shape it did would have been a little much, but it was clear that the United States and Britain were carving out an area of interest in Western Europe, setting the stage for some form of transatlantic dominance. And the Soviets were also looking not just to take back territory they had lost to the Germans, but also to expand their territory. And where that ended was unclear. Where those two sides would meet was unclear. And once they did, it was unclear whether that would hold, right? And pretty early on, there were things like the Berlin airlift and other conflicts that seemed to be right on the edge of a new war, and one that this time would be fought with nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
And
and
so
so
there's an enormous amount of fear.
and that was the next question I had is how much of an impact does this fear of a nuclear war have on the this idea of a creeping Russian infiltration?
Oh, enormous. And of course, for a time, the US was the only one with a nuclear weapon. And so that generated fears of, certainly it generated a certain sense of security for the Americans, but it also generated a lot of fear because there was an assumption that, look, eventually the Soviets are going to get a nuclear weapon. And so on both sides, civilians or people in the United States or people in the West assumed that the United States was going to be an aggressor and try to use its nuclear monopoly to start to take territory. And of course, the Soviets thought that as well. Now, that wasn't actually the case. We were certainly willing to give the Soviets their their desserts from World War II, but there was this animating fear of what would happen when one country, which had used nuclear weapons already, we were the only country and still are, knock on wood, the only country to ever use nuclear weapons in war. So would we use them again? And especially when things like the Berlin airlift in 1948, or the blockade and the airlift became a touch point, a crisis. Would we use nuclear weapons? It was unclear. I mean, I think in hindsight we weren't going to, but people didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, and your book, it's amazing because you hear about the hearings in the 1950s all the time. I mean, the McCarthy hearings are chapters, if not whole books, in numerous books that I've read about, but you don't hear about hearings in 1946 in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And I didn't even know that it existed back in the
Yeah.
mid 40s. And you're writing about this, and I'm like, wait a minute. The did he is it a misprint? But there were apparently hearings in 1946 before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and the woman who you describe is Helen Reed Bryan, and she has to go and testify before this committee in the mid 40s. So describe how that committee was developed and what Helen was doing there 7 years before we all assumed that the hearings hit their high note.
Yeah. One of the ironies that I appreciate about this period and about the committee is that it was founded as a by or co-founded by a representative from New York who turned out to be on the Soviet payroll. And it was founded as an anti-Nazi, primarily as an anti-Nazi committee to hunt for right-wing subversion. But over the late 30s into the early 40s, it became the opposite of that, really going after what its defenders and its leaders characterized as sort of communist subversion within the New Deal and within the federal government. And it didn't get much traction. People were not paying attention. No one wanted to be on the committee. It didn't get a lot of funding. It was sort of seen as this sort of corner for crackpots. But then after World War II, it very quickly became this reinvigorated bastion of anti-communism that would go much further than the Truman administration would in fighting communism. And it sort of became almost like a watchdog or an attack dog against an administration that its defenders said was soft on communism, if not pro-communist. So Helen Bryan, and the reason I pick on, well, not pick on, well, the reason why I pick her up and really focus on her, she's the bookends of the book. Not only does she humanize the story, right, she's a very sympathetic character. I think really has a really interesting life story, but she was also the first, let's say, victim of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is to say the first victim of the Red Scare. She was the executive secretary of an organization, a nonprofit, that provided support for communists, some of them were communists, but for anti-Franco refugees from the Spanish American War. And these were people who were mostly living in camps in France, but needed to find somewhere to live. So a lot of them ended up in Spain, or a lot of them ended up in Mexico or Cuba. This committee helped them get there. And, to be fair, there were questions about where the committee's funding came from and what its leadership was made up of. But the committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, saw it as this leading edge of communist subversion. They really blew it out of proportion and accused everybody of being Soviet agents, accused Helen Bryan of being a Soviet agent, and called her down to Washington to hand over all the papers of the organization. And she refused. And it was in a very dramatic hearing. She says, "No, I won't." These men on the committee, they're all men, berate her, end up finding her in contempt. And she went to prison for this. And she was the first of many people who refused to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee and went to jail for it. And even those who didn't go to jail, they saw their lives destroyed, they were fired. I mean, this is the same committee that just over a year later, after Brian's appearance, would start to go after Hollywood writers and producers and directors and eventually actors and create what we now know as the Hollywood blacklist. That came out of the committee as well.
So I want to ask, what exactly was the Communist Party in the United States? How successful were they in gaining true political power?
Oh,
How many
yeah.
people were in the halls of different local, state, and national government?
Yeah. So, this is one of those things where you can certainly find people, I think fairly reasonable people, who believe that the Communist Party had its hands in everything. The reality is that the Communist Party was, in the 1930s, a decent sized, very small political party, right? So, decently organized, very active at the grassroots, but with a lot of turnover because, it wasn't like other political parties. This was an organization that required its members to do readings and to show up for long meetings every week. And, that kind of thing that after a while, only real ideologues are going to be into. So, at any one moment, the party might have had a certain number of members, but those are mostly short-term members. It's a lot of turnover. But at the same time, the leadership of the Communist Party was in direct contact with Moscow and took money from Moscow. And, to say they took orders from Moscow is both true and overstating the case. They sort of read the tea leaves and did what they thought Stalin wanted. Some of those leaders were in turn involved in espionage. And that's it's important. It's important for people to recognize that this was not that there were elements of the Communist Party that really was actively supporting the Soviet Union to the detriment of the United States. And they ran spies in Washington, the effectiveness of which it's another conversation. But that's really what the Communist Party was. Now, by the end of the war, the Communist Party actually boomed during World War II, in part because it was very pro Roosevelt and very pro war because we were allies with the Soviet Union. Now, once the Cold War set in, and even kind of before that, membership was tanking. I mean, look, at the end of the day, communism does not find, healthy soil in the United States. This was something that Truman and Eisenhower both realized, and I think guided their approach to the Red Scare was just to say, look, at the end of the day, yes, this is a national security issue. It's a law enforcement issue. We need to make sure that there are no spies in the government, etc. But they weren't really worried about communist revolution. They weren't even worried about active communist engagement in Hollywood because they understood, look, Americans are pragmatic people. Americans are not ideologues. They may dabble, but they're not going to commit.
When it comes to how you put this book together, I do want to ask about that. I love asking authors about that.
Yeah.
And um, uh, first of all, you've written about a fascinating array of things. You've written about Teddy Roosevelt. You've written about Martin Luther King. You've written about the Red Scare now, and you've also written about whiskey.
Yeah.
How do you draw the line from book to book here?
I'm lucky in that, I'm not an academic historian, so I don't necessarily have to have a through line for
Yeah.
what I write about. I'm not, I sort of write about American history. Writing about whiskey is I'd say almost a second career. There's a lot of history there, but it activates a different part of my brain. In terms of the history writing that I do, I think a lot of it for me is this intersection of politics and culture is, it sounds very vague, but it's what animates me is, you have these big political questions and these big stories in American life, and whether it's the assassination of Martin Luther King or the Civil Rights Act or the Red Scare. And what interests me is how that then filters down into everyday life and how that shapes everyday stories. What was it like to live during that time? What was it like to be a member of the Rough Riders with Teddy Roosevelt? What was it like to, actually be a foot soldier in the fight for the Civil Rights Act? These things really interest me, and how those things then feed back up into politics and high politics, right? How does that all come together? And then how does that move forward? With with my Teddy Roosevelt book that's about the Rough Riders, I was interested in the story that they lived, but I was ultimately interested in what impact did that have on American culture? And I make the argument in the book that it had a pretty big impact on American culture going forward, and how America saw itself, that the Rough Riders and the Spanish American War were these seminal events in American history more than we understand. And the Red Scare I'd say, my approach is very similar. Not only to say here is an event, here is an era that needs to be better understood, but I kind of leave it at the end of the book for the reader to draw conclusions about how that experience filtered down through history. How did it shape things? And, we tend to think of history as these explicit, discrete periods, the 60s, the Depression era, etc. And yes, periods start and end, some messier than others, but they all leave traces. And one of the things I think is really interesting as a historian, but also just as a reader, as anyone interested in history, is to think about where those traces lead us, because it's not Newtonian. It's not here, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. It's much messier. And to me, that's really the most interesting thing.
How does your newspaper reporting inform and impact the way you write books?
Well, coincidentally, for the last couple of years, I've been writing obituaries. And it's great training for what I do, because I think so much of what makes a good, compelling book is rounded, engaging characters. And every day, my job is to write rounded, compelling stories about characters, in who, in my case, who happen to have just died. And so that's great training. If you can capture somebody in 500 or 800 words and really explain who they were and make them compelling to a reader, if you can do that in a book, then you're a good ways there. I read a lot of books that do a lot of other things very well, but they don't do that. And I think that that is a shortcoming. And then, before that, I was worked in politics and opinion writing for a decade. So, that background just gives me a good, I'd say grounding and understanding American politics and American history.
What sources did you use for this? Did you view this as a book that you had to find new things, or could you rely on much of what had been ferreted out so far and put together your own argument?
Yeah, I'd say both. I mean, this was certainly not a book where I thought, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find new killer evidence that's going to change everything. My feeling was, that might be out there, but a lot of the specific questions, evidentiary questions, have been hashed out. To me, it was more about certainly finding new characters, new stories to tell. And to that extent, I was looking for new material, but not in the sense that I thought that would change everything, more that it would help illuminate the analysis. And ultimately, to me, it's the analysis and the argument, the explanation that I give for the Red Scare that motivates and I think drives the book.
When it comes to, um, you know, uh, when it comes to the reaction that you're hoping to get from the book? Is there a preconceived thing? I hope people say this about it, or are you willing to just let the reviews come in and let the readers weigh in and see if you achieved the goal of enlightening us on an important period?
Yeah, I mean, I'm look, I've been at this for a while, so I'm somehow still, I don't know, naive enough, innocent enough to believe that people will read it. Everybody will read it in good faith and come away with a new understanding. Um, I'm sure many people will. We live in a very charged political time, and that doesn't always happen, even when you think it should. But with this book, I really hope, look, there's an argument and there's an analysis, and people are going to argue against it. But I also think that people who dive into the book from a variety of points of view will find a lot to support them, whatever their points of view are. I mean, I think, you take something like people who are activated by cancel culture. They don't like cancel culture. Uh, well, they're going to find elements of this book that maybe will surprise them because, there's a strong analogy, metaphor, what have you, in the Red Scare for fears of cancel culture. I mean, I think ultimately anybody who's interested in some take on civil liberties will find something in this book that they find sympathetic, that they agree with.
All right, so I want to get back to the plot here a little bit. You mentioned Truman and Eisenhower. How did they react to the possibility of either communist incursion or rooting communists out of everyday life in America? Did they see this as a real threat? And how much time did they spend on this with all of the problems that they had to deal with as president?
Yeah. So, Truman is an interesting character because on the one hand, he came into office almost as not an accident, but uh, a lot of people doubted whether he was up for the job. And I think ultimately he proved them wrong, but there was a lot of question early on whether he could step into the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt. And one of those areas was, and actually do better than Franklin Roosevelt, because one of the criticisms of Roosevelt was that he did not take domestic communism seriously as a threat. And so Truman, once he got into office, was faced with a twofold problem. Globally, the Soviet Union was making aggressive moves into Europe and into the Middle East. And out in the Far East, you saw China falling to the communists. So he had that to deal with globally. Domestically, he had a lot of people, whether it was in Congress or J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI, saying, "Look, we've got a real problem here. There are Soviet spies all throughout the government," and they had pretty good evidence. And in fact, now that we look back on it, they weren't wrong. Um, they were their information was a little outdated, was very outdated. The Soviets had more or less wrapped up their espionage efforts, but there was reason to be concerned. And I'd say one of Truman's great mistakes, and I think Truman, to the extent that he would admit it, did admit it. He gave in and he created essentially a loyalty program through an executive order that required the FBI to look into the personal histories of millions of American federal workers and to conduct full-scale investigations into anybody who had anything that could be considered possibly subversive, right? So if you had any kind of affiliation or even a relative, you might be investigated. And even that at the time was sort of a scarlet letter. So you had suddenly thousands of American workers, federal workers, and contractors, and it didn't take long for this to spill out into the general public and the private sector. You had all these people who, for no reason at all, were being under threat, were found themselves under threat from being fired, being punished, and all of this as a result of Truman's loyalty program, which I don't think he really intended to be that way, but it
Hmm.
wasn't written very well, and it ended up with a lot of unintended consequences, and really more than the effect of the loyalty program itself um, validated the idea that we have got to find communists everywhere. We've got to do everything we can to find them and root them out. And of course, this became a um, bureaucratic order, right? If you're told find the communists, you can't come back and say, well, there aren't any. You've got to find them. And so Truman ultimately, I mean, he didn't take the threat that seriously. And and I think that that to some extent is as almost as bad as someone who takes it too seriously, because he sort of flobbed off a program that ended up being very destructive. Um, Eisenhower, my reading of Eisenhower is both very similar and very different. I mean, Eisenhower was much more stridently anti-communist than Truman, but he was also like Truman in that he had a very pragmatic view of the American public. He also didn't think that the threat of communism went further than it actually did. And so, his approach was he also had a problem within his party, right? Which was there was a huge wing of the Republican Party by this time under the sway of Joseph McCarthy that uh, was insisting on witch hunts everywhere. And Eisenhower took probably more time than he should have, but eventually decided that the answer was, on the one hand, to crack down and to say, okay, we are going to double down. We're going to do what Truman wanted to do, but the right way. And we're going to hunt these people down and get rid of them. And that was a calculated move and one that had consequences. But on the other hand, he drew a line and said, look, we're not going to entertain these conspiracy theories. We're going to sideline McCarthy and we're going to sideline the people who agree with McCarthy. And so essentially, he drew what I would call sort of a compromise. And, over time, helped bring the Red Scare to an end.
I don't want to go too far off the path here, but I do want to
Oh, please.
ask how much did the fact that Eisenhower was in the theater, fought in Europe, have an impact on his view of this effort to find communists at home?
I think, to some extent, more in the way that he was a soldier and he was um, you know, someone who had a strategic view of what was going on. At the same time, I think, most good soldiers are not ideologues, or most good officers. They have pragmatic approaches to the battlefield or to politics or what have you. And so he was very similar in that regard. Uh, when he was in the theater, when he was during World War II, he didn't have that much contact with the Soviets. It was only when he was head of NATO that he had some immediate perspective on the Soviet threat. But he was only there for a little while. And so, I'm not sure that it really informed him. I think for Eisenhower, he very much embodied the triumphalist view of America. And not coincidentally, that's what his administration and what the 50s are remembered for, is this idea that America fought the war, the good war. It has saved at least Western Europe and the Pacific from fascism. And there was now this virtuous cycle of American power and global prosperity. And at home, just normalcy, right? Sort of enforced normalcy. But, that ultimately is what I think Eisenhower wanted. And, that certainly did not sit well with the ideological far right of his party. And there were a lot of people in the Republican Party who hated Eisenhower, um, and were very angry that he was president. They were very angry with what he was doing, but he was successful in pushing them to the side.
You've mentioned Joe McCarthy a couple times here, so I want to ask, first of all, give us a little bit of a primer on where he came from, who he is, and then what clues there are earlier in his life that suggests that he would later on have this, for the lack of a better term, more this sort of streak of being a paranoid detective.
Yeah, I mean, I think. you know, McCarthy is a great example of someone who, in almost any other situation, would have been a failure as, say, as a senator. Um, would have been at best kind of just a loudmouth. But he had a particular set of skills and a particular approach to politics and to the truth that fit served him very well for about 4 years. And a willingness just to go to the wall. And in terms of what evidence there was beforehand, it would be hard when he was elected in 1946 to his first term as senator. It'd be hard for someone to look at him and say, this guy is going to dominate the national conversation. But part of that is because he was a gambler. I mean, both literally and figuratively. He was someone who was very loose with the truth. Um, but that's how he won his first Senate election, both his primary, and which was very hard fought, and the general election. A willingness to just say whatever was necessary and to bend the truth or to lie, if that's what got him into office. And so there's that. But those first 4 years that he was in office, he didn't do very much. He was seen by his colleagues as not really a team player, not someone who had any respect for the order of the Senate, not someone who really brought anything to the table. He was kind of an also ran. And it's funny, I mean, that was what happened, 1950, early 1950, he gave his first sort of famous speech about having in his hand a list of communist agents or communists in the State Department. He gave that in Wheeling, West Virginia, to the Cuyahoga County Women's Republican Party meeting. This was not a high profile senator being sent to a high profile event. This was about as backwater as you could get. And yet that's what his assignment was. And he had several other assignments. He was sort of on a tour around the country, going to tiny towns, speaking to Republican organizations. And and so it's sort of ironic that that's where he really made his name, with these speeches. And I think really what happened was, look, he was 4 years into a Senate race, or into a Senate term. He obviously wanted to be senator again, and he needed to find something. He needed to find a cause. And he had been pretty successful both in 1946 and then to some extent in the Senate of just making hay over communism. And, he didn't stand out. A lot of Republican senators did that. But if you read his statements and you look at what he was saying and doing closely, you can see, he's preparing. Now he probably didn't know he was preparing for his dominance of the American political conversation, but it was there. The seeds were there, and so it really only took this opportunity, this moment, in 1950 for him to really explode.
And so, what starts to happen between 1950, this moment he explodes, and then this moment that sort of caps it, where he's asked, "Have you no sense of decency?" What did American life turn into, particularly for the people who came under the crosshairs of the committee, and then also just, in everyday life? Is that person a communist? What was life like?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it depended. I mean, there were certainly a lot of Americans for whom this was not front and center in their mind, but for millions of Americans it was. And it was, both for many in an active sense. Maybe they worked for the federal government. Maybe they had progressive affiliations in their background. Maybe they were blacklisted in Hollywood. But for a lot of others, it was a little more passive in the sense that the Red Scare shaped the media that they consumed, movies and early TV and certainly books. I talked for a little while about the Mike Hammer books, which were just dominated the bestseller lists through the 1950s. And a common theme in those books was killing communists, and communists were, um, the bad guys. Mickey Spillane, the author, was one of the, was really the first person to grab onto commies as the bad guy, right? And we're used to that through anybody who grew up in the 70s or 80s is used to Rambo movies. And well, Mickey Spillane was really the first one to make them cannon fodder for a good American. And people lap this up. And you find it there were trading cards and toys and so communism, the fear of communists next door was everywhere. It was in schools were a particularly um, sensitive place, a particularly active place for anti-communism, whether it was, going through books in the library, policing teachers, going through curricula. The FBI had a program where if it found evidence that a teacher had something in their past, they would pass it along to a local school board and vice versa. People fed information to the FBI. There were hearings in Congress about schools, about colleges. This part for me is very resonant to today. But, PTA boards became battlegrounds for, whether our schools are being infiltrated by communists. And often we're talking about schools in the middle of the country. We're not talking about Brooklyn or San Francisco or LA. So this is all over the place. And, you know, there are, I'd say, a bunch of reasons why this all sort of came to an end. And on the one hand, you know, eventually people did what Truman and Eisenhower said they would do, which is sort of start to come to their senses and realize that, oh, there really aren't communists out there. This really isn't what we've been led to believe is, this threat. The Eisenhower consensus, the American miracle of economic growth and political stability really set in, and the Cold War started to relax. Stalin died, the Korean War ended, but also, as you say, McCarthy himself faced a Donnybrook in his pursuit of the elements of the army during the Army McCarthy hearings. He believed that there was communist subversion in the army and went after them. So there were these hearings in Washington that were watched by tens of millions of Americans, and the lawyer who was chosen to represent the army, Joseph Welch, was, I mean, he's a fascinating guy. He was an actor. I mean, he was a lawyer, but on the side, he was an actor. And he actually had a Golden Globe nomination later on, after all of this, for a role he played in a movie. But, he wasn't chosen for this, but he very quickly understood that what was going on was not a real trial. McCarthy was not on trial. What was really happening was television, and that he needed to not, his goal was not to land a legal punch, but it was to show the American people that this guy who has become the paragon of the Red Scare is nothing more than a bully. And Welch very systematically set up a trap. You know, I think sometimes, at least for people who casually pay attention to this story, they see it as, Welch being simply getting up on his high horse and saying, how dare, do you have no sense of decency, that he cracked. And I think Welch honestly believed that. But Welch also set up McCarthy. He baited McCarthy over several days to get him to crack. He even gave him bait. I mean, the whole issue was whether one of Welch's assistants was himself a communist.
Hmm.
And when McCarthy went after that assistant, Welch pounced, and he gave just, it is an amazing, not really speech, but set of statements against McCarthy that had the entire room, and honestly, the entire country, holding their breath. And when he was done, there were cheers. The chairman gavelled the meeting to a break. everyone filed out. McCarthy had no idea what was going on. And, there's probably, possibly apocryphal story that Welch, who was at the brink of tears, he was so emotional. As he walked out, someone said, I looked at him, he looked at me, and there was just that gleam of victory in his face. And, whether that's true or not, it's certainly the case that Welch put a dagger into McCarthy.
It sounds good. Uh, well, important question here. How did communism and the fear of communism get conflated with civil rights?
Yeah, so, going back to the 30s or even before, one of the things to say, I'd say, one of the things that the Communist Party really grabbed onto was civil rights as a cause. And there are elements of the party that were opportunistic about that, but a lot of people in the rank and file were were honestly very motivated by civil rights, were very active in pushing for civil rights in the 30s and 40s. And it sort of became a smoke taint, if you will, although it would have been there regardless of what communists did. Uh, it became a proxy for red hunters, right? If they knew that somebody was involved in civil rights, if they saw evidence that they had been in support of civil rights, then that made it likely, possible, worth investigating whether they were communists, right? And pretty soon, this became a almost lingua franca on the far right. If you are in civil rights, you are therefore a communist. The idea of civil rights is a communist idea. Ergo, anybody involved in civil rights is suspect. And you know, I think one of the reasons, the civil rights movement was very active in the 30s, and very active at the beginning of World War II. Took a back seat for a lot of the war. But after World War II, the civil rights movement did not really get back to where it was, get back on its feet until Martin Luther King appeared on the scene in the mid 50s. And so there's a 10-year period where there really wasn't much action on the part of the civil rights movement. I don't want to say none. I mean, there was, but not what one would hope for. And I think a lot of that has to do with fear on the part of allies and centrists and people who might normally be in support of the civil rights movement, who looked at it and said, "Oh, I can't be in support of civil rights because I can't lose my job. People are going to think I'm a communist." And so it really set the movement back, I'd say many years.
How important, well, and I feel bad, I'm like boiling down like the crux of
Yeah.
your whole book to like one or two questions, but I want to
Uh,
ask what the roots are for in today's politics in the Red Scare. How do we find the Red Scare begin to foreshadow what we're going through today? What is it, 75
yeah.
years later?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are,
85, right?
yeah.
85, 85.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things to look at. The first is that we still have the same cultural conflict that emerged from the 30s and really animated the Red Scare. And that is between, a liberal left that is very much in favor of an activist government, very much in favor of uh, civil rights, puts, say civil rights for all sorts of people, not just for people of color. Very engaged in the labor movement, and against that, a not just a conservatism, because I think there's, obviously there are lots of conservative critiques of this, but a particular kind of conservatism, a far hard right that wants to dismantle the legacy of the New Deal. And that animated a lot of the Red Scare in the 40s and 50s, and I think still maintains today. Now, it ebbed and flowed in terms of its influence on the general Republican Party, but it's hard to look at what's happening today and not say, oh, this is just the same fight being picked up once again. And the other thing, and maybe this is just a corollary of that, is a particular kind of conspiracy theory. Americans have always been open to conspiracy theories. There's probably something just about human nature. But since the 30s and 40s, there's been this particular conspiracy theory about the federal government and about what we call today the deep state. Now, back then in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they didn't say deep state, but it was the same idea that there was this elite, unaccountable bureaucracy in the federal government that was behind the scenes and running things to the detriment of American society and in favor of an alien ideology. Now, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, that was communism. Today, it's woke, DEI, whatever. And, it's not that there's no there there. There were communists in the federal government, there were spies, but not many. It was blown out of proportion. Today, depending on, I think there is legitimate concerns, whether you share them or not, about, overextending diversity, equity, and inclusion as a idea in government. But it's become this boogeyman for going after anything and everything that the far right doesn't like about the government. And this follows directly from the Red Scare. And this goes beyond the scope of my book, but I think you can draw kind of a genealogy of who are the thinkers, where are the political streams as they come down through history, and plug directly into kind of where we are today. So I think both of those things pull us forward from the 1950s to today.
As participants, as voters in today's system, what should we take away from this story to inform our own decisions about government and to make sure that we don't put people in office who make the same mistakes and have the same pitfalls as what led us to the Red Scare in the 40s and 50s?
Yeah. I mean, that's the $60,000 question. I mean, I think awareness of the extremes in American society and a wariness of the extremes is throughout history has been an important guiding light. Not to say that there aren't truths to be found in the extremes, but political movements that identify on the extremes are things to be wary of, I think. Um, and at the same time, a commitment by the public, and this is the big ask, and I certainly don't expect people to necessarily do this, but to be truly informed. And so much of what happened in the Red Scare might have been avoided had people simply taken the time to look behind the sound bites and the news and the speeches and say, is that true? And honestly, just to bring a healthy skepticism to people like McCarthy. Too many people listened to what he said as the truth and never looked to see what was coming right behind him, which was clear evidence that he was lying. And we need that today. It's much harder than it was back then, but in some ways it's much easier. We are faced with a fire hose of information, but also the truth, the facts are readily identifiable. You just need to be a better news consumer to get those. And, I mean, I think ultimately we just need more pragmatism, more common sense in American life. I know that sounds very naive and probably doesn't carry very far with a lot of listeners. But at the end of the day, people just need to understand that stories that we hear about conspiracy theories and about evil people doing evil things are almost never true. And the idea that there is this monolithic elite within the government that is doing harm to the public is just demonstrably untrue. And I think any study of the Red Scare will inform and help shape that understanding today. Um, the other thing I think, knock on wood, this is really the question that keeps me up at night is look, the Red Scare ended and it had terrible consequences, both immediately and long term. But we also didn't fall down as a country. We continued to make progress. The civil rights movement came afterward, women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, etc. And I would like to believe that we can find our way to the same sort of outcome today. But I don't know. History doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes, but it doesn't repeat itself. And as a historian, I'm always wary of telling people today what they should think based on what I know about the past. All I can offer is stories that hopefully animate people.
Who are Haywood and Margaret? I love asking authors about their dedications, and so I got to get
Yeah.
that in there.
So Haywood Moxley was my high school mentor. Taught me all about writing, really encouraged me to be a writer. He was my English teacher for several years, but also just a friend. People often talk about teachers that they've had that had a big influence on them in the classroom. Haywood was a really good friend of mine, and he was young, and his wife is Margaret,
Yeah.
who I got to know really well. She was a teacher. I went to a boys' school. She taught at the girls' school. So I got to be good friends with them. Then later on, when I was starting to try to build my career as a writer, Margaret had left teaching and had gone into journalism and was an editor at a local newspaper and gave me my first gigs and really encouraged me as a professional writer to kind of pick up on what her husband had taught me in the classroom, to really put that into practice. And so I think without the two of them, and they're still great friends of mine. I still see them all the time. And you know, when when I think about where I am as a writer, how I've gotten to where I am, I would never have come anywhere close were it not for the two of them. So I wanted to dedicate a book to them for a long time, needed to get through, you know, family, kids,
Yeah,
parents.
why kids? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But fortunately I've been able to write enough books where this one's for Haywood and Margaret.
Is there going to be another one? Do you think you have it in you to do
Oh
another
yeah.
book? Yeah.
You
Have you decided yet?
I better. I'm on contract. So
Okay, good. Yeah.
yeah.
Have,
Yeah,
have you
I
decided what you'll do
otherwise I'm gonna
next?
owe somebody some money.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that one's going to be, my agent for a long time had been encouraging me to find a story that blended history and whiskey. And I resisted for a long time. There's not really anything that gets me going. But I finally settled on this story of sort of, I guess you'd call them two whiskey barons in the 19th century, who we're at opposite ends of every spectrum. They're two flawed, fascinating characters, very powerful and politically powerful, powerful in their industry. But they really built through their animosity the modern whiskey industry, but also shaped things like the Pure Food and Drug Act and antitrust laws, and had a big impact on the political culture of the late 19th, early
I'm
20th.
one of the people who would say that you can tell America's story through baseball. Can you tell America's story through whiskey?
I think you can. I think it's a different take, obviously, than baseball, but I think you can tell the story. So much of whiskey started as this thing that farmers would do to take advantage of excess grain. on the frontier. And then by the end of the 19th century, it was an enormous industry. It at one point, so there was a monopoly or a near monopoly of whiskey production in Peoria, Illinois, and it paid something like 50% of the federal excise tax, or it was responsible for 50%. It made so much whiskey. And, so much of the response to the excesses of that period drove the progressive era, drove what became prohibition,
Hmm.
but drove ideas about changing American culture. And so I think especially that period, you can understand a lot about American culture and American history through learning about the whiskey industry.
Hmm. Clay Risen, the author of Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
It was. Check out the book on his website, clayrisen.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.